Okay. Well, this recipe, let's see, had chocolate mint in it. I have this recipe for no, chocolate mint. It's not just recipes in this book. Every year I plant a windowsill garden and cross my fingers for success. And when I travel for more than 3 days, either my plant sitter mishandles the watering or the rising room temperature wilts my delicate herbs. And so no one worries at all in the end because I can rely on Athens Daily Groceries Co-op, Brooklyn's Green Grape Provisions, or a farmer's market for fresh mint. And so there must be a special kind of mint that is called chocolate mint and has a chocolatey taste and gives flavor to peppermint candies or mint tea. It's a game changer, she says. Okay, so let's see. Why are we having? I just thought that was interesting. There are a lot of recipes for ice cream and ice creamy things. Remember the raspberry yogurt pops? Okay, so you need to follow the directions for that. I like something like that. It's healthy, and I watch my waistline. Roasted nectarine sundae. Well, that looks very pretty. I have have a couple of things bookmarked. Okay, cake, cake, cake. And this has some important, before we do any recipes, before we read about any recipes, I want to read you something, okay? In the decades leading up to the Civil War, which we talked about, 1861 to 1865, the fine food of the plantations where the rich white slave owners, slave enslavers really lived, would not have been available, would not have been possible without the creativity, hard work, and skill of enslaved cooks who cracked coconuts, caramelized sugar, sifted flour, ground sugar, and whipped eggs without the modern conveniences we have today. Anne Byrne, who wrote something called American Cake, so you can look that up. It's so easy for people to say things like working like a slave. It's as if we are so far away from actual slavery that we can allude to it casually. My almost 100-year-old great uncle remembers the mechanisms of sharecropping, which came after slavery. It was when Black Americans worked for no or low wages, though, a vestige of the American slave system. Sometimes when I'm in my kitchen preparing pound cake for a 4th of July celebration, remember I said today's July 5th, we just celebrated the 4th of July, so she says, sometimes I imagine what it would have been like for my ancestors literally slaving to prepare a strawberry pie that would never touch their lips. I'm reminded that Juneteenth didn't symbolize the end of work. It symbolized the beginning of working for yourself, working for your loved ones, rather than for someone else's loved ones without pay. That thought makes me smile, can make me smile when I'm peeling that peach for cobbler. And then she goes back into all those wonderful recipes. Let's do one more. I liked that chocolate ice cream. It was dairy free. Some people need dairy free, but there's always chocolate ice cream that does contain milk. And I think there's a recipe for the one with milk and eggs, but that was even harder because you had to remember saying working like a slave. Some people use the expression slaving over a hot stove. Well, that involves working over a hot stove. And even though you're working for yourself in the summer, you might choose not to have a hot stove on. So we have, devil's food, icebox cake. And this involves a lot of cream cheese and sugar and cocoa powder and heavy cream and chocolate wafers and things like that. And I don't know why it's called icebox cake, but I'll bet she tells us up here in the description. Juneteenth coincides with summer heat. It's a time when a lot of us are trying to spend as little time in the kitchen as possible. And if you have freedom, you don't have to spend all that time in the kitchen. This dessert requires minimal baking and is so perfect for the dog days of June. Dog days is another expression. It means the hot days of June. Okay, but if you're up for it, she thinks making wafers from scratch is very rewarding. Often when we buy a prepackaged ready-made ingredient, we infer that we could never make it at home because we don't have a big cookie factory with teams of workers. But everything they make at the dessert factory started with one or two people in a research kitchen doing things that you could do at home. But you got to have time. Well, if you have freedom, then hopefully you not only are not a slave, but your job gives you some days off. That's another freedom that people fought for in a different time in American history. They fought to have shorter work weeks and not be paid, not have, and have less long hours and less low pay, and have shorter hours and more pay because they thought that was fair. And that's a whole different story, but that's another chapter in American history. And so if you have days off, then you can do something like making this devil's food icebox cake. And that's another story, but I said that's another story, but oh wow, this looks good with the fruit among the decadent sweet stuff. But so that's another story, but it's also a story that is about fairness for people of all skin colors, because to this very day, people with darker skin, people who are Black, Indigenous, people of color, BIPOC, like I said, they tend to work at very low-paying jobs, and even though there might be only a 40-hour work week or less, they might only have a part-time job, they might have to put one or two or even three jobs together. I think that's awful. I think everybody deserves some time when they can do their own thing and be free. Well, here are some notes on Juneteenth from this book, A Cookbook for Juneteenth and Black Celebrations, Watermelon and Red Birds. I want to just close. I got to return some of these books to the library, and they have books about Juneteenth. So notes on Juneteenth include books about it, articles about it that you can find mostly on the internet. And some of these articles are history, some of them are recipes, public collections and exhibits. For instance, this first one is a collection of the Dallas Public Library. You can view it online. NAACP Youth Council Picket Line, 1955 Texas State Fair, Don't Sell Your Pride for a Segregated Ride. We talked about what segregation was. There's a website for that. A few more things. Film and video, websites about Juneteenth in general. I hope that everybody will take the time to learn about Juneteenth now. I have this book it's also meant for grown-ups, but these two are really meant, well, this is really meant for the whole family with adult or very much older teenage supervision. I think adult supervision. These are pretty tricky recipes, and adults, you're going to need to plan for these things. Okay, but another book that is good for adults and maybe teens or maybe older kids who are up for reading a lot of history over a couple hundred pages, and some kids are, and an index and different footnotes and stuff. This is about the reckoning with the history of slavery across America, so that, I don't know, if you grew up in a white family like I did and you went to, I went to Mount Vernon where George Washington used to live, but it was also, he freed this country, but he had slaves of his own. This book doesn't talk about Mount Vernon. It talks about Monticello. That's where Thomas Jefferson lived. Thomas Jefferson is, of course, the man who wrote the Declaration of Independence, which is what we celebrated yesterday, the 4th of July. The Declaration of Independence is what it made the United States of America. I'm going to turn to the table of contents. Okay. There's a difference between history and nostalgia. Monticello Plantation, and it talks about the terrible conditions under which the enslaved people lived and worked at Monticello Plantation. Even though Jefferson was writing, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Nothing about women, but he also didn't mean to include Black people or people of color. He meant just white people. But you have to. I hope you'll think about the history of this country and the 4th of July, because I still think it was good that we got rid of monarchy. That was a step in the right direction. We just had a lot more things to do besides that. our Independence Day, Galveston Island. Remember, Galveston was where the last enslaved people found out that they were free. This is on page 173. I haven't gotten to this part yet, but let's just flip down to 173. See how it starts. I have to go backwards. 176, 172. The long-held myth goes that on June 19th, 1865, Union General Gordon Granger stood on the balcony of Ashton Villa in Galveston, Texas, and read the order that announced the end of slavery. Though no contemporaneous evidence exists to specifically support the claim, the story of General Granger reading from the balcony embedded itself into local folklore. On this day each year, as part of Galveston's Juneteenth program, a reenactor from the Sons of Union Veterans, that would be the Sons of Union Veterans would be descendants of people who fought in the Civil War on the side of the North. So a reenactor from the Sons of Union Veterans reads the proclamation at Ashton Villa while an audience looks on. It is an annual moment that has taken a myth and turned it into a tradition. Now, why is it a myth that Colonel Granger stood on the balcony of Ashton Villa? What's the myth part? Did he read the Emancipation Proclamation or not? Or maybe it's that he read it, but he didn't stand on the balcony of Ashton Villa. Or maybe it's that it didn't happen exactly on June 19th. Might have been June 18th, June 20th. Maybe it's just something that nobody recorded, even though by this time, by 1865, people could record the time and events. They didn't have all the computer stuff, all the internet stuff, but they did have pen and paper. They could have recorded the date. I don't know what part didn't get recorded, but some part became just a myth and nobody's really for sure. Talks about where Galveston is, and talks about, and then it talks about Galveston Island, and it talks, so you can hear more about the story of Ashton Villa, Galveston Island, Juneteenth in this particular chapter. So this is another nice book, well, informative book and interesting book, and not always nice, but ultimately, hopefully, it points the way towards a nicer time when we will consider each other's. All right, before I leave off the books for big kids and grown-ups and teens, I want to talk about the story of Juneteenth. This is a kid's book from my library. It's from a series, You in History, okay? And this is kind of it's an interactive history adventure. That means there are 3 story paths, 46 choices, and 22 possible endings, and you choose. So in this book, this is by Stephen Otifinoski, must be Otfinoski or Otfinoski, I'm guessing. Looks like this might be a picture of Colonel Granger. It doesn't look like he's standing on a balcony at Ashton Villa. He's not standing on a balcony. He's riding a horse. Looks like there are a lot of people who are raising their hands, maybe in joy. Maybe these people are still working. The soldiers have a tough job to do as well as a dangerous job. Hopefully the soldiers understood what they were fighting for and felt that it was important enough to risk their lives for it. But the story in this book has you imagining that you are an enslaved person, and probably a young person, a teenager, or maybe somebody who just entered their 20s. Maybe you just have a child of your own, and now your child is going to be able to stay with you and not get sold, and there's no threat of your child being sold away or anything like that. And now you're free. You don't have to work on the plantation for the person who enslaved you, but you have to somehow find a way to earn a living. So what are you going to do? And how are you going to make enough money to keep yourself and your family fed? And so there are all these choices. You might decide, a lot of times, you might decide you need to keep working for a white person in the South, and they might not be able to keep you as a slave anymore, but they might continue to treat you very cruelly and give you horrible work conditions and make it very hard for you to leave. They might bully you a lot. They could do that because there wasn't the police protection or the court protection that they're the same that, for Black people as there was for white people. To this day, there still a lot of times isn't, and we have to work on that. Okay, but you might go north and you might find new opportunities there, or you might go north and it might not be much better, and you might struggle, and you might eventually find that things worked out for you or not. Well, that's kind of the American story of people that immigrated to this country from all different countries, like my own ancestors who were white, but they were immigrants from Eastern Europe. It's a story of people who came to this country from other parts of the world. It's the story of the pilgrims that we celebrate on Thanksgiving. It's probably the story of a lot of Native Americans, but we really need to know more about their stories in modern days. We don't know as much, and that's sad. So really, everybody's story is always about making choices, and this book says you choose right here. But this is a kid's book. But kids, as you grow up, whether or not this is a story that has you imagining yourself as a freed person who just got freed from slavery, and this goes back in history. But even to this very day, even if whether you're poor or rich or whatever, you have choices to make about how you want to live your life. And even though you may not, if you're rich, you may not have to struggle for money, but you have to decide if you want to be a good person, if you want to help other people, or if you just want to be selfish. That's a choice, and there are consequences for all choices. This is interesting because you can... Well, as you flip through, you see some pictures. This is Ashton Villa, and this is where he's believed to have done the reading of the proclamation that set the last enslaved people free. It says it's the first brick house to be built in Texas. It looks very nice. The shutters are closed. It's not all boarded up. The shutters are closed because the sun beats down very hot in Texas. Okay, so let's see. There are choices like to take a wagon with Sam and not return it to your slave master because you just found out you're free and you don't have to be slave anymore. To do that, turn to page 18. To strike out on your own without Sam, turn to page 21. And if you do that, you see what happens. And you feel bad about say you take Master James's wagon. You feel bad, but the attraction of freedom is stronger than your sense of right and wrong. And how good was Master James's sense of right and wrong? On the other hand, stealing his wagon, well, two wrongs don't make a right. So there's that, you might want to think about that. You and Sam make your way to the outskirts of Galveston. Within a few hours, you are stopped on a dusty road by a sheriff. Where are you boys going with that wagon? He asks. To tell him you're heading back to Master James' plantation, go to page 19, because even though you're free, you could still get in so much more trouble for stealing something than a white person could. Even after you were free, if you were a Black person, you could get in more trouble than a white person. Okay. So headed to Master James' plantation, you say. Hurry along then, boys, the sheriff says. Sam is disappointed as you head toward the plantation, but you are relieved not to be stealing. And so Master James is too busy dealing with the news of emancipation to ask where the supplies you were hauling have gone. Sam, your friend, who is a fellow enslaved person, goes to talk with the other slaves, but Master calls after you. How would you like to stay on here to work for a while? For wages, of course, he says. Having a job with pay may seem like a good way to start your new life, but like Sam, you're eager to move on and see what freedom feels like. So do you accept Master James's offer and turn to page 22, or do you strike off on your own? Turn to page 25. Let's say you strike off on your own and turn to page 25. See what happens then. Page 25. Where are you? Page 25. Mr. James is sorry to hear you want to leave, but he understands. You say goodbye to the other former slaves who have been like family, and you walk away from your slave life. There's a picture. Many freed blacks searched on foot in search of jobs, traveled on foot in search of jobs and new lives. So if you decide, you may decide to do that. This is a story. This is you taking on the character of a young man who's just been freed from slavery. You reach a small town a few miles to the north. There, on a street corner, you're surprised to bump into Sam. They're starting up a card game in the saloon, he tells you. How about joining us? The only thing you have of worth is your banjo. Maybe you could bet with it and win enough to buy a train ticket north. But you could also end up losing your banjo. And if you keep your banjo, maybe you could make enough money playing the banjo and having people throw money in a hat that then you might be able to buy a train ticket up north. These are all the examples of the kinds of things you have to think about. So this is an older kids book that might be interesting for Juneteenth. It is The Story of Juneteenth, an interactive history adventure by Stephen Otfinosky. It is part of the You Choose books series within the You History. I have to look on the inside front page. I'll write down the exact series when I send this off to YouTube for everybody to see. All right. Well, thank you for joining me for, I guess this was Peace and Understanding with Miss Francine and about Juneteenth. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed all these books that we've done. Bye.